It's time for another Travel Buddy interview as we discover how the church together has been called by Jesus to trust, share, serve, and invite followers of Jesus. This week, we've been looking at the story of the disciples caught in a storm and Jesus calming that storm. Our travel buddy today from Trinity Presbyterian Church is Mike Shelton, and he's going to be interviewed by Bella.
The disciples had many adventures with Jesus once they dropped their fishing nets and began to follow him. The story we are reading this week are certainly a memorable adventure for the disciples, but it's also a bit scary. The disciples were in a boat on a lake when a huge storm started. The disciples were frightened. Had you ever been in a storm that was frightening? What did you do to stay safe?
Yeah, I bet they were frightened. I have never been out on a boat when a storm came up, but I grew up in a town in the foothills of South Carolina, and we used to get tornadoes sometimes in the springtime as the weather was changing, and storm fronts would come through. If you had just the right combination of weather events, we could get tornadoes, and they were pretty scary. Just the thought of what to do when a tornado came along. When I was really little, I used to think I could crawl under the bed, and that if I was under the bed, the storm couldn't see me and couldn't get to me. I learned a little bit later that they were stronger than that, and that there were other things that you had to do. And so the things that we did to stay safe were probably pretty much the same kinds of things that we did with our daughter when she was little, and we'd have a water spout come up or a tornado threat. And that was, you go to to a room that is as close as possible to the middle of the house and doesn't have openings and so forth, and you just kind of hunker down in that room until the storm passes.
One way to talk about the difficult times in our lives is to refer to them as storms. In the story, we learn about two things. First, that Jesus was with the disciple even during the storm, and second, that Jesus could calm the storm. Can you think of a storm in your life where you know that Jesus was with you and that your faith in him helped you to calm?
Oh boy. I am in my 60s now, so there have been a lot of storms. I may be even older than your grandparents, for that matter, at this point in life. If I think back to the days when I was a young man, one of the first storms I remember dealing with had to do with what I wanted to do in terms of a career. I had chosen a school. I had gone there for 2 years, and all of a sudden I had thoughts of going into a career that would require me to go to a different school in order to get the major that I wanted. And so I struggled with that decision because I really loved the place where I was. Finally decided that I'd make the transfer, and lo and behold, I got there to the place where I was transferring, and it turned out that after a week I realized this was not the place for me. It just was not a good fit. The kids, it was a party school, and that just wasn't the way that I enjoyed getting along. And I realized that I was going to need to go back to the place where I started if I was going to get the educational experience that I needed and be able to live in a way that I was comfortable with. And so I spent a week actually at the other school before I transferred back to my original school. And during that week, I really struggled quite a bit because I had a lot of friends who were at the new school and so on. But it just, I had to look for guidance elsewhere, and I think that I found it in my relationship with Jesus.
What do you learn from the storm in life that would have been hard to learn some other way?
And I think the biggest thing that I've learned through a number of different storms has been that even though the storms are scary, they don't last forever. And you know, there's always a way through them. And I always know that that the folks that I love are with me, that God is with me, and that I'm precious to Him whatever happens. And so I think the thing that I've learned that I would not have learned otherwise is how much when we become vulnerable, when we're in situations where we could be hurt, there's always God's presence there with us, and that helps to get through the difficulties that the storms bring and the scary things that the storms bring.
We also see Jesus walking on water in this story. I bet disciples didn't know he could do that. I bet they didn't know that with Jesus' powers they could survive a storm at sea. Did you discover something new that you could because of a storm in your life?
Mm-hmm. Something that I could do that I didn't perhaps realize that I could do before that. Yeah, I think, you know, my real answer to that question is that every one of those storms that comes along probably makes us feel a little more self-reliant, a little more aware of all the things that we can do. It makes us, I'd say the knowledge that we have God's presence with us can give us the confidence that we need to be able to try things that we otherwise might not have tried, to be creative and make good decisions that we may have been afraid to make otherwise if we hadn't been aware of those things. I think that's been probably the greatest value of the storms in my life. And, you know, to get back to your question about whether you could have learned those same things without the storms, I don't think that I could have. I think that if we were just comfortable all the time and life was going along on an even keel all the time, and we never were challenged and never felt that life was stormy, we might not ever stretch ourselves. We might not ever reach out to God. We might think that we're doing just fine the way we are. And the storms help us to see that maybe we're not quite there yet, and that we do have opportunities to grow when challenges come along.